I want to welcome you in tonight and thank you so much for attending tonight's program on Race, Monument, Memory, a panel discussion. I'm Kate Holland. I'm from First Parish in Wayland. I'm their Director of Lifespan Education and Engagement there. And we're very excited that we were able to work with the Wayland Public Library on this program tonight. I also want to take time to thank the Lydia Maria Child Fund for the grant that they gave us to help make this program possible. Before we start, I just want to do a few Zoom housekeeping notes. The program is being recorded for broadcast on Wayland's cable access station and will also be made available on YouTube. Feel free to enter your questions using the Q&A app on Zoom. And also there is a chat feature which you may also use, but please don't put questions in the chat because they'll probably get lost in the chat. The chat is just to talk to other panelists or to our tech host, Matt, if you're having any problems. And now I'm gonna hand it over to Courtney Michaels.
Thank you, Kate. Welcome, I'm Courtney from the library. We're so excited to be collaborating with First Parish. I would like to thank also the Friends of the Wayland Public Library, as well as the Wayland Cultural Council, which is a local agency supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a state agency, for their support of this event, which is the final program in our Wayland Reads 2021 series. And now it's my privilege to introduce our moderator, Stacen Goldman, who is the curator at the Framingham History Center. Stacen holds an MA in history with a certificate in historical agencies and administration from Northeastern University. Previously, she served as the director of the South End Historical Society in Boston. Her work is focused on democratizing historical collections and imagining creative ways of engaging with history through material culture. You can read about these goals at Stacen's blog, The Thoughtful Museum. And now I'll hand it over to Stacen, who's also a mom like me. So, and you're muted.
Hi, thank you. I'm sorry about that little daughter Zoom bomb there. I am Stacen Goldman, and I am the curator at the Framingham History Center and on again, off again blogger at the Thoughtful Museum. And I'm so excited to be moderating this discussion today. I think a lot about monuments and public memory and the way that it affects basically public knowledge of history, because I have a background specifically in public history. So I'm just so psyched to be here moderating this panel and talking about this. So first, I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to give a brief bio, and then I'm going to give them an opportunity to really introduce themselves more in depth. So we're going to start with Angel David Nieves. He's the professor of Africana Studies, History, and Digital Humanities, and the director of Public Humanities at Northeastern University. Dr. Nieves is the author and editor of 2 books on African-American placemaking in the US. His current scholarship, focusing on the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and technology in the US and South Africa, is in the vanguard of digital history and the use of experimental online publishing platforms. Kabria Baumgartner is a professor of English and American Studies, as well as core faculty in the Women's Studies at the University of New Hampshire. Dr. Baumgartner is an interdisciplinary historian of 19th century African-American life and culture in the United States, and is the author of In Pursuit of Knowledge, Black Women and Educational Activism in Antebellum America. In addition, Professor Baumgartner is on a public humanities project to illuminate the African-American experience in Essex County, Massachusetts. Shawn Quigley is a park ranger with the National Park Service at the Boston African-American National Historic Site, where he serves as a guide, conducts local outreach, and manages social media. Shawn began working at the site in 2012 as a student and graduated with a BA in history from Suffolk University in 2014. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it to them to give more in-depth introductions to themselves and to talk about really what kind of work has brought them to talking about monuments and race and public memory. And we're just going to go alphabetical by first name. So Dr. Nieves, you are first.
Thanks. Oh, thanks. I'm live. Whoops, I have my mic is live. How is it? Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. This is probably not exactly how I wanted to do this. Yeah. Let's see. Can I show you slides? 1 second. Sorry. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit discombobulated. Can someone else go?
Sure. Kabria, are you prepared to introduce yourself?
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just have some brief opening remarks about this session. And I want to first begin by thanking the organizers who planned this event, my co-panelists, and all of you for joining us for this conversation. And I do think it's a really important conversation, especially this week, given all that has happened. From the continued tragic displays of state violence and racism to the feeling of uneasiness, I think, within many of us as we awaited the verdict in the Chauvin trial. And then just sitting here, right, this evening in the aftermath of all of that, trying to process loss and despair and relief. So I was thinking about some of the social media reactions to the verdict on Tuesday. And I remember a couple of different ones I want to share, and I want to see if I can sort of relate this to the topic of public memory and history and monuments. So one person said that we should thank the Black teenager, I think she was a 17-year-old Black girl, for bearing witness to a murder that she shouldn't have had to witness. And I agree with that very much. And I wish her all the peace in the world. Someone said we should give thanks to the thousands and thousands of protesters who peacefully assembled last summer, their constitutional right to do so, in cities and towns across the country, declaring that Black Lives Matter. And so we are indebted to the Black Lives Matter movement, absolutely. The protests last year in particular provoked questions and considerations about Black life, the experiences, of course, of people of color, systemic racism and other forms of oppression, and also race and memorialization. And I thought about all of that, of course, but I was really stuck on this issue of public memory and race and memorialization because I am a historian of 19th century Black life and culture in New England. And I had been asking questions like, how do we memorialize and who do we memorialize and when? And these protests last summer really resurfaced those questions. And so last June, I remember that Tory Bullock circulated a petition which garnered almost 13,000 signatures. It could be more at this point, actually, calling for the removal of Boston's Emancipation Memorial statue in Park Square. And there had been calls to remove that statue before, but Bullock's petition brought renewed urgency to the matter. And this is all within the context of the protest. And I don't know if people are familiar with the statue, but essentially it's a towering Abraham Lincoln and a crouching enslaved man. And sort of you have this myth, right, of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, freeing the slaves, right, with the stroke of his pen. And the role of the enslaved in his or her freedom is erased, completely erased in that statue. And the agency of enslaved people is obscured and diminished in the statue. And it made me think, right, who is the statue for? Because it's not for Black Bostonians, right? It's not for people of color who have been committed to and fighting for civil rights and racial justice. So one of the questions that other historians have asked and that I've asked too is, where are the statues that tell the stories of Black Bostonians? There are a few in Boston, like that of Crispus Attucks, Phyllis Wheatley, there's Harriet Tubman Square. But then I remembered, right, studying the 19th century and even the late 18th century, there are other Black activists who are not part of Boston's landscape that absolutely should be. And one of those people is sort of my biographical subject, that is Robert Morris, who was the first Black civil rights lawyer in the United States. And he was a Massachusetts native, born in Salem, Massachusetts in 1824. And he studied law in Boston in a lawyer's office, and passed the Massachusetts bar in 1847. And he had an illustrious career. He argued civil rights cases, not just in Boston, but in Cambridge, in other areas of Massachusetts. He fought for school integration. He fought for the rights of fugitive slaves. But he also worked outside of the courtroom. He lectured on citizenship and Black freedom. He organized a Black military company. And he participated in the 19th century colored convention movement, which is basically, I like to think of it as a Black organizing, what we might think of as Black Lives Matter today. We had something maybe similar to that with the colored convention movement of the 19th century. So Robert Morris was absolutely a pioneer. And what's interesting is that, to my knowledge, there is no statue, no marker, nothing about Robert Morris. In fact, I would argue most people have never heard the name and don't know him, and might be surprised that he was the first Black civil rights lawyer, and that the first Black civil rights lawyer is from Massachusetts. So I wrote an op-ed about all of this. I'm happy to drop the link to that in the chat. But essentially, I think that we should know who Robert Morris is. We should know who other Black activists are from our past. And I think he's particularly important because the story of civil rights is really a story that runs through Boston and runs through Massachusetts, and we should really know and cherish that history.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Kabria. We're going to go back to Dr. Nieves for his introduction. He is all set up right now.
Yes. Thanks so much. I wanted to frame some of my comments around the question of public memory. And I would say public memory, like other forms of memory, exists on a kind of a broad spectrum between memory as an object and memory as a process. And at times, memory becomes more fixed in the public imaginary, and at other times, it primarily consists of contestation over how to remember the past, to transform what is widespread knowledge into formally recognized truths. I would argue, allows the state to acknowledge its misdeeds in many ways. Fortunately, this process has not, however, made certain that the state-sanctioned official narrative of events that we've come to hear, particularly the kinds of narratives we've heard around the Black Lives Matter movement and the pathologies waged against African Americans and Latino and Brown and other men, is really one that is circumscribed in many ways over the extant physical locations of places across the US where we have fought for liberation. And I wanted to continue talking today in this conversation about public memory and sort of bring you to a place that is particularly close to me in my heart. And over the past few days in particular, Cape Town. And to sort of talk a little bit about the beheading of the Cecil Rhodes statue that happened a little less than a year ago and only 5 months into the pandemic. The Rhodes statue depicted here has been long associated with British imperialism and the global slave trade. Rhodes led British colonization across Southern Africa in the 19th century and made his personal fortune from the extraction of mining across South Africa, and in particular, made his fortune around diamonds. And as you see in these photographs, the Rhodes Memorial in Cape Town was built in 1912 on the slopes of Table Mountain and features 8 lion statues alongside steps leading up to a granite building where the beheaded bust is located, and you're seeing that here. The statue had been previously targeted and was first vandalized in 2001 when red paint was splashed on it. In 2017, its nose was cut off but was restored the following year. The campus is replete with statues, memorials, and commemorative plaques to Rhodes. Another statue of Rhodes at the University of Cape Town was removed in 2015 after he became the focus of protests against colonial era leaders. The hashtag Rhodes Must Fall movement led to a broader student uprising and movement to decolonize education across South Africa. Rhodes, a revered figure during the days of the British Empire, founded the De Beers Mining Company in South Africa and also took control of territory in Southern Africa that eventually became Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Scholarships, the Rhodes Fellowships, the Rhodes Scholarships allows and still allow overseas students to come to Oxford and still bear his name. Rhodes believed that the English were the master race, and for some historians, he really is the sort of father of modern fascism. And some have even argued that Rhodes was the first man to organize business politically. His diamond industry was the first great cartel. His was the dream of an elite, a secret society that ruled whole continents by money, controlled by a single source. His hope was for a great British Reich. And Rhodes was even lauded by Joseph Goebbels as a rare force man, considered atypical of the often cautious and hesitant British. Rhodes was just one of the people among many officials who pushed a white supremacist ideology, who helped prepare the way for the apartheid state by working to alter laws on voting and land ownership. Interestingly, in Zimbabwe, there are still calls to have his bodily remains moved to the UK where he was born. Removing statues of Rhodes across Cape Town's cultural landscapes really reflects an ongoing engagement with the ways that memorials, museums, monuments are not considered to be static or frozen in time, but should reflect the ongoing debates in local and national memory, making us to the ways that the apartheid state was forced to its knees in the wake of student-led activism beginning in the mid-1970s. And over the past 3 days, I've been watching in horror as images from my Facebook feed reveal the extent of the recent damage climate change has brought to Cape Town, South Africa, specifically after a series of bushfires ignited portions of its often verdant green hillsides and engulfed landmark buildings at the University of Cape Town. The university was clearly ill-equipped to handle the rush of the fires that destroyed significant parts of their African Studies library, a collection of irreplaceable colonial-era holdings and countless other collections. I mention Cape Town in part because libraries and archival collections across South Africa, even at a resource-rich institution like the University of Cape Town, are in constant jeopardy for a whole host of reasons. Climate change is yet one more important factor that we need to be particularly mindful of, especially in the context of the African continent, and the need for looking a bit ahead or down the road at ways of making sure that archival preservation and sustainability of cultural heritage are more fully considered, realizing that climate change will have more and more impact in the coming years globally. In a post-apartheid South Africa, under President Mandela's leadership at the time, the heritage industry began a comprehensive series of national projects. And here are just some images of some of those national projects where essentially they built these institutions, these sort of public-facing institutions, including these national museums, to respond to societal needs and pressures as a way of restoring justice. However, many questions remain as to what moral ends might actually be achieved through these public state-funded institutions, such as the museum. Museums in particular matter because of their emancipatory potential, I argue, and for their ability to move beyond their permanent exhibitions to engage in more relevant and messier narratives about the past. Numerous public, private, and international initiatives at museums and commemorative sites are now trying to really deal with this challenged legacy, the legacy of apartheid and the struggle against its brutality and degradation. South African museums have undergone significant changes since the end of apartheid, and it was clear that South Africa wanted to tell a different kind of story about its past. The one place that I've come to know over the years most closely is the Hector Peterson Memorial and Museum, and in particular, the building itself can be seen as a kind of direct result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as a kind of long-term mission of promoting healing through redemptive public acts. The building itself sort of acts as part of that bearing witness, but also as part of that redemption, trying to really tell about those human rights violations and to tell a different kind of story in this building. And it remains an important building and an important place to think about the student uprisings of 1976. And I would say that through its emancipatory potential, acts as a kind of conduit for finding a way to tell those stories and to sort of bear witness to the past. Museums and organizations motivated by community groups have also been forced to coordinate and share their best practices between sites of conscience around the world. Organizations now looking together such diverse sites include slave housing, death camps, tenements, work prisons, and torture chambers include the International Coalition of Historic Sites, Museums of Conscience, the Committee on Conscience at the Holocaust Museum, the International Coalition of Memorial Museums for Victims of Public Crimes, and the Center for Transitional Justice. All of these organizations seek to jointly institute a kind of global space of human rights and citizenship through critical dialogue with the past. So I'm wrapping up. As South African historian Leslie Witz has argued, a collective national past was crafted by the government, the South African government, to really try to present a national inheritance and labeled a kind of heritage that this past was to be utilized as a powerful agent for cultural identity, reconciliation, and nation building. And in 2004, some 10 years after the initial efforts to build these townships museums, a local organization that I began working with, the Soweto 76 Student Foundation, wanted to tell a very different kind of story about the past, a story that included the voices of women and student activists and found a way to make it more visible. And in working with them, we began to develop an online digital archive, an interactive website. And here I'm just showing you a very quick demonstration of that platform that we developed, and we've been sort of perfecting it ever since. Digital projects never seem to be done. And in closing, I want to mention Alex Borain, who as deputy chairperson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, talked about a third way of trying to deal with the past. And for him, South Africans desperately needed to create a common memory that could be, quote, acknowledged by those who created and implemented the apartheid system. And I will rephrase that, instead characterizing it here as a system of slavery.
Ordinary
sorry.
Township.
I'm going to lower the volume.
A typical township house.
Can you still hear me? I hope. Yeah. And part of what I think is really important, and what Borain was trying to tell us, was that instead of characterizing it here as a system of slavery followed by a century and a half of oppression, and one that we can also draw lots of comparisons here into the US, I think in many ways we can begin to ask similar questions, and I wondered if we could perhaps have a similar process here to begin to hold accountable in many ways the kinds of institutions that we make and have made, and make museums some of those transitional sites that deal with some of the messier histories here in the United States. And I'll sort of leave it there. Thanks. I will stop share.
Africa specifically. Oh, I was muted. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I learned something new. I don't know very much about South Africa or the history of South Africa. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Shawn to do his introduction. Shawn Quigley of the National Park Service.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to Wayland Library, and also thanks to co-panelists here as well. So my name is Shawn Quigley. I have been working with the National Parks of Boston now for almost 9 years. And I have spent majority of my time actually on the north slope of Beacon Hill, exploring the history of Boston's free African American community that lived there in the decades before the Civil War. So Dr. Baumgartner, I'm very pleased to hear all the stuff you're doing about Robert Morris. That's very exciting for definitely the stuff that we talk about on the Black Heritage Trail Tour. So I have definitely become, like I think a lot of people in this nation, as we've definitely had a lot of national dialogue about who we are, who we memorialize, what we celebrate, and really specifically looking at, you know, those memorials and Confederate memorials, memorials to the Confederacy. And I actually, in 2017, was tasked with a couple different members of my team to explore the history of a Confederate marker that actually existed in Boston Harbor at George's Island, Fort Warren, which was a prison during the American Civil War. And it was really interesting because through that study, I learned more about the process of how those memorials came about, how something like a marker to Alexander Stephens and to high-ranking Confederate diplomats who were imprisoned at Fort Warren, how a marker ended up there to honor them. Organizations that created those markers, such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a group which actually did have a chapter that in Boston, active as, you know, late as the early 2000s. So kind of learning about that and understanding, you know, how these things are created and how not only those memorials and markers honor people, but shape our understanding of the past and, you know, shape certain narratives has been something that, you know, I have really been interested in studying a lot about. And, you know, again, like Dr. Baumgartner said, is something that is obviously very timely. So, you know, looking at those Confederate markers has definitely been something over the past few years that I have definitely been, you know, more interested in learning about. So, you know, that is one of the areas of the many areas of the 19th century that I've been focusing on in my work.
Great, great, thank you. I want to thank all three of you so much for that introduction. That was great. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to start by having a little discussion. And I think I'd like to start here a little bit with some Monuments 101, specifically because we may have people who are coming to this conversation who are not as aware about the history of the establishment of these monuments and of problematic monuments, not just in New England, but obviously all over the country and internationally. So I actually, Shawn, that's a great sort of way to get into. Let's talk about how these monuments came about. How did these things become a part of literally our physical space here in Boston?
Sure. So what I'll do is just kind of focusing in on really, again, talk a little bit about the Confederate markers that existed on Fort Warren, just to kind of talk about that process. So what you really begin to see in the United States, and this isn't just limited to Confederate markers. I think if you look at the landscape of monuments, you know, I kind of have picked this up. If you go to any kind of town square, you know, in states that were here during the American Civil War, it's likely that you're actually going to find a memorial dedicated to the men who died, you know, in that struggle. Because so many people died, this was a way for people in the nation at the time period to cope with that, you know, insurmountable loss. No one had really kind of ever experienced something like that before. And what you also get emerging from that simultaneously is this idea of the lost cause, or this idea where the Civil War was not a war about slavery, it was a war about shared sacrifice, valor, states' rights, you know, and the nation is healed. And that idea of the nation healing, I think, is where you begin to see monuments like the one that ended up on George's Island. Now, this wasn't anything that was, you know, huge initially put there in 1935. This was a plaque. There was one later put in 1963 that was more of a marker. But focusing on the plaque, you know, this was a major ceremony on George's Island where you actually have members of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, so like a Union Veterans Organization, the Daughters of the Confederacy, which was obviously an organization honoring the Confederacy. They paid for this marker to be put there as well as funds raised by other individuals. But there's actually a remarkable account of this where they have a Union and a Confederate veteran come out to the island in 1935 and like shake hands symbolically over this marker to signify that, you know, the nation is healed, which, you know, obviously that was not true. But I think what you see is, in addition to these markers being put around and these monuments, you know, where you see these massive statues to Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, you know, these Confederate generals, and this is an attempt to shape narrative, to shape understanding, to shape how we collectively remember the American Civil War. And it was an attempt, as actually literally the Daughters of the Confederacy said in like their founding documents, to create a true history of the war between the states. And, you know, I think that this is something that is found not just in monuments and memorials, but also in shaping of, you know, textbooks that are given to local schools. They had very powerful connections that they could use to really help shape narrative and shape understanding. And, you know, memorials are put in place by communities who want to honor something, honor people. And, you know, I think that when you look at those Confederate monuments in memorials, they are put there to shape narrative and also to help find, you know, meaning in that conflict. And it was ultimately, you see a lot of these monuments being put up to help shape that narrative that erases the institution of slavery from the history of the American Civil War. It's woven in the fabric of that lost cause narrative, and is something that, you know, obviously is still very much with us today.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So I think what sort of strikes me there is you're talking very specifically about how these items that we put into the built environment are ways of shaping narratives. And specifically when I think about monuments or building names or memorials, I don't necessarily think of them as educational objects. I think of them as signaling objects. They're objects that are meant to signal specific thoughts, specific ideologies, to the people in a space, to people who inhabit that space, who move through that space regularly. And I just love to hear from each of you about the different signals that the monuments you've encountered, either in or around Boston, or, you know, in South Africa, or really anywhere in your travels, the signals that they seem to send to you and that you might think they'd send to different groups of people inhabiting that same space. Who wants to start?
You know, I think monuments, both in Boston and in South Africa, can be deeply personal. And I think they're experienced in different kinds of ways, depending on whose story is being told and how you actually encounter them. I think there's a very different way of engaging with monuments if actually you're on your own as opposed to actually going to a monument with someone else. I think there's a very deeply kind of reflective thing that can happen when you're on your own versus as part of some kind of tour group that's been forced to go visit some site or look at a place for a specific reason. And so in South Africa, you know, one of the ways that monuments, and there really are informal ways that monuments get built, you know, by the community versus very formal sort of national monuments. It makes me think of a statue that was recreated of the famous sort of Hector Peterson shooting image of one boy carrying another with the sister running next to them. And this statue was put in a mall in Soweto. And I think it made people deeply uncomfortable. And I think that's what one of the messages was, that it wanted to make people feel uncomfortable, because you're in this mall to sort of shop and have fun, but then suddenly you're also having to deal with this deeply personal, deeply impactful kind of image of this boy dying in another boy's arms. And I think it kind of changes and it changed the way people really thought about those events, because they were forced to do it in a place that they're not used to, you know, thinking about these things. It makes me also think of Faneuil Hall in a way, That, you know, you go to Faneuil Hall for knickknacks and ice cream, I guess, and not necessarily to sort of engage with, you know, the history of the Faneuils and how they got rich. And so I think there's some interesting ways that monuments act individually on the personal kind of level, but then, you know, collectively when you're in a group. I don't know how others feel, but it made me sort of think about, your question made me think about that in particular.
Dr. Baumgartner, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was thinking of sort of two examples. The first is Toni Morrison and her novel Beloved. I remember teaching it to my students last year, and we were looking at, and she was sort of reflecting on why she wrote the novel and the importance of remembering the history of slavery in the United States. And I was particularly struck with an interview I think she gave where she talked about the fact that when she was writing the novel, there really were no monuments or memorials to slavery or about slavery. And that we have that more recently now, right? We've seen some of that, but when she was writing her novel, it didn't really exist. And so in some ways, Beloved became this novel that was a monument. Because we didn't have one. We didn't have them in particular geographic places. And then I was also thinking about Germans in Germany, where memorialization is really important so that they don't forget and the nation remembers, right, the Holocaust and the tragedy and brutality of that. And I remember walking in a small German town called Lerach, not too far from Freiburg, if you sort of know this area of southern Germany. And I remember walking through a marketplace. And so, you know, Dr. Nieves mentioned this. So you're walking in a place where, now it's just you buy, you know, snacks and food, and okay, it's, you know, it's very commercial. But there was this monument there, and it said, today is a marketplace, but during the Third Reich, this was, you know, a place of tragedy where 1,000 Jews were put to death. And you're struck in that moment, right, with that history. And in that moment, you can't forget. And I find that particularly powerful. And those kinds of markers and monuments are all over Germany, and I'm not saying Germany's a perfect country, it's not, but they're doing something with memorialization that I think is something the US could do, especially when it comes to the tragedies that we've faced as a nation. I think they're really powerful in that way.
Shawn, do you want to add anything? Has it all been covered?
I would just say, I mean, I think provoking emotion and personal response and personal reflection are definitely, as you both said, you know, these are things that, you know, I think are great, can be great with public monuments and markers. You know, personally, I think of one of the places that we do a lot of our interpretation is the Shaw, Massachusetts 54th Memorial right on Boston Common. Which is a monument dedicated to one of the first African-American regiments, a group of soldiers to fight for the Union Army during the Civil War. You know, and it's a monument. It's very striking. It's a piece that took 14 years to complete. So obviously there's a lot of detail, but you go and you look, and you know there are Black men marching. You know, individual faces, some old, some you know with facial hair, some without. And it's a monument that's completed in 1897, when that's not a typical public depiction of African Americans in American popular culture. But at the same time, you know, where I may experience that as this really inspiring piece, others may see it and see the Colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, on his horse, you know, above those men, which I think is also a reflection of not just glorifying what, you know, those men did fighting in a war, which when they joined became a war to end the institution of slavery, but also the fact that they're fighting in segregated units. They're being paid unequally. So, you know, I think it's a monument that you can look at, you can experience that artwork, and you can see the, you know, glory of that. But you can also see in that reflection the pain and the discrimination that, you know, those men must have felt. So I think that that's a monument in particular that can, you know, provoke very powerful emotions, positive and, you know, kind of more reflective.
Yeah, I think responses to monuments, especially right now, this is what really is making the news, is public responses to monuments and the way the public has chosen to deal with monuments, take some of this into their own hands. There was the beheading of the Columbus statue in in Boston. I mean, he's been beheaded, he's been drenched in paint. All kinds of things have happened to that statue over the years, which is now resulting in the eventual removal of the statue through this sort of like forceful protest. But then, of course, you have the example of the Emancipation Group, which just got a huge groundswell of support and this petition to have it removed. But there have been all of these different ways that the public has been interacting with problematic monuments. And I have to say, because you work for the Park Service, Shawn, I'm especially interested to hear the Park Service perspective on what some people might term the desecration of the monuments, and specifically altering monuments. But I would love to hear all of your responses to the way the public has chosen to take responses to problematic monuments into their own hands.
So I think monuments in public spaces are ultimately a reflection of the values of that community, right? So, you know, if it is that public square and you do have, you know, a monument, say like the Shaw Memorial, or on the flip side of that, you have a monument, a large statue to Robert E. Lee. You know, I think it's important for the public and the people who walk past that every day, see that, to have those conversations. You know, because I think that is a really valuable piece of these monuments, right? Is to spark conversations, to spark understanding, to try to use them as tools to understand a collective past or a narrative, whether good or bad, that has, you know, helped shape our understanding of where we are today as a nation. You know, I think that they can be very valuable tools of interpretation. If you do have, you know, trained historians that are in these spaces, can look at these monuments and help folks who are coming to see them understand that. Or if you do have, you know, those interpretive plaques or waysides or something like that, to put these things within context. You know, I think if they're looking at all of those, you know, monuments and having those conversations, I think is one of the more powerful ways that these symbols can be used as kind of a part of that national dialogue.
Dr. Nieves?
You know, I often think, and it's informed a lot by efforts in South Africa to really rid the landscape of these racist monuments. And I'm not exactly sure that that's the best alternative. I kind of always want people to do an installation to accompany some of these statues, some of these monuments, that tells, you know, a sort of corrective about it. I mean, in some ways, I kind of want the beheading of the Columbus statue to be remembered in some kind of way, to be on a plaque, you know, that says this was a reaction that people had in, you know, 2020 to the rise in awareness about racial injustice in this country. And, you know, Columbus was venerated at one point, but, you know, he needs to be seen as a problematic figure, and there needs to be a way to sort of do some of that. And I know Dr. Baumgartner and I have talked a little bit about different ways in which, you know, using 3D technologies might be a way to sort of do some of that intervention work, right? Using cell phones and using VR or augmented reality to perhaps provide those alternatives in the sort of built environment for those messier kinds of stories. But I really bristle sometimes about the complete removal of these statues, only because I think there's a way in which the kind of amnesia that, you know, comes into play and can sort of take over if you forget why they were there in the first place and who put them there. And I think they're important to remember for those particular reasons. And I do think they need to have some of these kind of interventions, right? This kind of public art intervention. I often think about an exhibit that was done in Baltimore. It was called Kicking It with the Masters, and it was by an African-American artist. And what she did was she did sort of installations next to all these great works of art that sort of troubled these art pieces in some really interesting ways. And sometimes it makes me think about, what if we did a little bit more of that and sort of supported public art in a way that could provide some of the correctives, but just, get us talking, in public space again about these controversies, about these kinds of issues.
Dr. Baumgartner, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I agree with my co-panelist here. I mean, so what to memorialize publicly really should be agreed on by a diverse community. And, so public memorials and monuments should reflect the community's values. I think the problem is just historically that hasn't been the case, right? And we see this with Confederate monuments. Confederate monuments were built to intimidate African Americans, right? Not just, if you think about the monuments in the South of, Robert E. Lee or Alexander Stephens, I mean, these are impressive monuments, right? They're on pedestals. I mean, African Americans are kind of being told to stay in their place. And even though slavery was lost, there are other ways in which African Americans will be subjugated, right? That's what these monuments sort of represented. And so African Americans at that time, when they could, they objected to it and they resisted and they protested them, but they were limited in the kinds of protests and resistance they could be involved in, they could do, right? We're at the same time, late 19th, early 20th century, we've got lynching. So they're limited in what they can do. So now we're talking about these Confederate monuments. We're talking about, why they exist. And I agree with Professor Nieves. I think we want to have those discussions because we don't want to erase that, right? We want to remember and hang on to that. And going forward, we want to be careful about what monuments are erected, right? We want to be fair and we want to be inclusive when we're thinking about these new monuments.
This is actually a perfect end to, to one of my next questions, which is, should there be criteria for establishing modern monuments? And what do you think that criteria would be exactly? What would it be, at least ideally, in your world? Dr. Baumgartner, I know you're working on establishing a monument, or you're talking about establishing a monument right now. So if you'd like to kick us off, that'd be great.
So I'll start with a couple. So these are some of the questions that I had for currently existing monuments, but I think you could also ask them for monuments that you might want to build. One is, does the monument or memorial distort history? I think that's really important. For me, in the case of Robert Morris, it's really important that if there is a monument to him, or at least a marker, that it is a story not just of him, but of this larger fight for civil rights. And how that's conveyed, I'm not an artist, so I can't speak to that. But that's something that I would want the monument to represent, not just him, but also the battle for civil rights. The other question I had was, does the monument or memorial advertise a lie? So the Confederate monuments, as Shawn Quigley said, were about the lost cause myth. That's a lie, right? We know slavery, this idea that slavery was about states' rights. I mean, to some extent it was, but it was about slavery. The Confederacy was about slavery and upholding slavery. So the lost cause becomes, affixed to these monuments, and that's a lie. So the question we can ask is a memorial a lie? And what can we do to tell the truth about a particular event or a particular person or a particular ideal? So those are the first two. I have more, but I'll save them.
Shawn, why don't you give us your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I echo a lot of that. I agree with a lot of what Dr. Baumgartner just said. I mean, I think memorials should be reflective of, there should be community input on these things. But I mean, also I think you have to take an honest assessment of the landscape of monuments that you currently have. If you look around on, for example, I just, obviously I'm located in Boston. So you think like there's a William Lloyd Garrison statue, there's a couple Charles Sumner statues, there's a Wendell Phillips statue, so it's like honoring the abolitionist movement, but you look at that and it's, white men, and whether it's getting a memorial to like a Lewis Hayden, who was an Underground Railroad safe house operator and political activist. A monument to Robert Morris would be pretty cool. Or, you know, Ellen Craft, Harriet Hayden, you know, Lewis Hayden's wife, who also operated that safe house. You know, I think looking at kind of the monuments again in like that public square, right? Those public spaces that people are going to walk by and see, and, you know, look at, know the names, looking at trying to kind of diversify that to tell that more diverse story of the space that you're in, because, you know, the obviously looking at that lens of the abolitionist movement, you know, was obviously not just white men. So I think making sure that, you know, you had that community input and also getting more of a diverse, you know, set of monuments or memorials.
Dr. Nieves, is there anything that you would want to see done in the process of establishing a new monument or memorial?
You know, I think monuments are often, except for the Gould here in Boston, that shows you know, multiple numbers of soldiers and people. I often think monuments are kind of singular to a single person, and I often wonder what monuments would look like if they were being constructed around social movements, right? Like, what would a monument to the abolitionist movement really look like, that sort of showed that it wasn't just by one person, but it was by many people who worked together as a kind of network, right? Who affected change in a more complicated way, right? I think we're moving away slowly from the individual actor or actress, you know, in sort of significant historical moments, and we're beginning to sort of see, and I think some of that reexamination has come about by great scholarship that's looking at the women of the civil rights movement, right? That's beginning to sort of really hold to account that it wasn't just, you know, these great men, but there are lots of people. I mean, thinking about all the MLK Jr. sort of monuments that exist, or the naming of streets after, you know, MLK, I think, you know, you fundamentally misunderstand the civil rights movement, for example, if you don't understand the work of all of the women that undergirded someone that made, you know, MLK possible, that made it possible for him to do the work that he did. And so I often try to think about the ways in which we might talk about social movements and how do we memorialize that in some interesting ways, and in ways that maybe push us to think beyond the individual actor.
That's great. Was there anything else that you wanted to add, Dr. Baumgartner, that didn't get hit on? I know you said you had a whole list, so I just want to make sure we don't lose it.
I think that kind of covers it, and I would just echo Dr. Nieves's point about you know, perhaps moving away sometimes from you know, an individual toward monuments to movements or to ideals. I think that there's something particularly powerful in that. You know, a monument to civil rights that is not, you know, 20th century MLK, but is in the context of Boston, 19th century, you know, abolition, education, right, the fight for equal school rights. I think that would be particularly powerful as well.
So I think it sounded to me like overwhelmingly like the three of you would in general prefer the recontextualization of existing monuments or better education around existing monuments rather than removal. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in that assessment. And I'm wondering if there are things that are other than adding a plaque next to an old monument that could sort of radically change its symbolism or its meaning. I was extremely inspired by the statue of Jen Reed, the Black Lives Matter activist in England, after they toppled the Colston statue. And they put, I mean, it was not with permission and it got removed, but there was a statue put on that same pedestal of a Black Lives Matter activist. And I thought that was so powerful. And even honestly, the Lee Monument in Virginia, and the way it has become a canvas, an incredible canvas of public art, of graffiti, of projection for the history of slavery and civil rights in this country. And I'm wondering if there are ways that you envision monuments being sort of more radically or artistically recontextualized in the future. I think maybe there's something beyond the plaque or the the well-trained historian standing next to it.
Well, I was just going to say quickly that, I do think the community should decide if there's a particular statue that they find objectionable. That community should, debate that and consider the merits of removing that statue. But I am for the removal of Confederate monuments. I mean, that's just kind of where I stand on those. I think that because we know the narrative that surrounds those monuments, because we know that they're, very, and they were and still are insidious. We still know that a lot of Confederate generals, their names are on schools. I'm for that renaming. Do I think monuments to Lincoln should be removed? Probably not, because I think Lincoln is a transformative figure. I think actually talking about his transformation as somebody who held a pretty racist ideas for much of his life, and then sort of, shifts to being less racist is important. We can, think about that, and there's a ways, and there's something that he did that's pretty powerful, right, in the Emancipation Proclamation. So I'm not for getting rid of Lincoln statues, but Confederate monuments, absolutely. And I think for the Emancipation Park, I mean, ultimately they did decide to remove it, but I think there was a lot of discussion that went into that. I don't know if Shawn was part of those or knows, kind of the details of that, but that there was the commission went and talked about that. There was a lot of evaluation. So I think communities with partner cultural museums, that those are the kinds of conversations that should take place. But I'm also for transforming sometimes these statues too. So, graffiti on Robert Lee sounds good to me.
Has anyone else seen like a more radical sort of change of a monument or a statue that has been inspiring to them?
Dr. Baumgartner mentioned Germany, and at different points, artists have done some interesting things with some of the monumental buildings. They've covered over the buildings, they've draped the buildings in shrouds, and I wonder sometimes, what if we did that for a while to some of the statues that we find particularly problematic at this particular moment, right? What if we shrouded all of these Confederate monuments, right? And I think it would force a kind of discussion that people aren't having if you are walking along or driving past the public square and there's a statue that's suddenly shrouded. It's going to make you ask why. Like, what made that happen? Why is that statue that I've walked past and ignored for most of my life suddenly shrouded? What does it sort of tell me? What does it sort of tell us about where we are today? I'm in agreement with the renaming of lots of places that hold the names of white supremacists. I think colleges and universities are notorious for naming sites and locations after certain people who once we sort of re-examine them, we realized how insidious some of the work that they were doing, was. And I think we should be renaming those buildings and thinking differently about them. But I do think that at some point we've got to also make sure that there's a way of remembering that this was named for someone problematic, and that it needs to be recognized in some way, because when you start to edit, I believe, the landscape too dramatically, there's going to be that kind of tendency to forget what was there, or to overlook what was there, and there isn't enough of a uncomfortableness with keeping sometimes those statues and having them shrouded, let's say, and what it forces people to have to say. It would be such a great lesson for school age kids to have to see a statue that they've long walked past or seen, and suddenly it's shrouded. Well, mom, dad, why is that? So I think some interventions are necessary. I am also not an artist, so I can't say what some of those things might be. I often think, and it made me sort of chuckle the other day when my husband was talking about a friend of his, and they went around putting new labels in MoMA on some of the artwork. This was back in the 70s. They were being very, you know, contrary and sort of interventionist, but they were going around putting new like labels on certain paintings and renaming them. And eventually they got pulled over by one of, well, they got sort of shouted out by one of the security guards who said, "You don't think we're noticing that you're doing all of this? You know, that you know, we've got cameras on you." But just the very act of doing that, you know, sort of deliberate action to rename something like, you know, a piece of art or to do an intervention like Banksy does, I think those are the kinds of things that we need to encourage and support more artists of doing in some ways. You know, throwing the paint on the Cecil Rhodes statue, I think doesn't deface it necessarily, but adds another layer of story to it in some interesting ways.
Shawn, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I definitely echo with the I'm not an artist, so you know I don't think it's creatively about these things, or I just want to stand up and you know try to talk to people about them. But you know I think, and I was trying to look up his name and I couldn't find it, so I you know regrettably it's an artist who did, I want to say a couple of years ago, he took a creative look at some paintings, you know, where you look at like 18th or 17th century paintings that actually did feature enslaved people in them, and they were more in the background. And what he did was he either, you know, took another layer and really turned the focus where he kind of whited out the, you know, person that the painting was actually on and turned the focus on that enslaved individual. And, you know, essentially use that as a way to say, you know, this person is a part of this story and this narrative too. Let's also try to understand, you know, where this individual is coming from. So, you know, I mean, I think different like artistic renditions or including, you know, individuals who do have that more artistic touch than, you know, the National Park Ranger standing here might would be really beneficial to include and kind of say, hey, we can provide context, we can provide history, but like you can do that creative thinking to look at this and see different ways that we can go about, you know, not necessarily erasing anything, but also providing that context, providing a new, different artistic rendition.
So I said I would have you out of here by 8:30. So I have just one sort of final question for you, and then we're going to open the floor to the public Q&A. And I would just love to hear what you envision for the future of monuments, public art, building names, these sort of monumental ways of nodding to history. Who wants to start?
You know, I would echo what my panelists have said, and I think maybe we need a comprehensive program to, and here's where I'll sort of draw on my architect background. We need to sort of have a massive sort of public charrette where people come together to talk about and rethink what they want to see have happened to some of the monuments that exist out there, and to even talk about the monuments that they think are missing, you know, that we don't have out there. I mean, while Dr. Baumgartner was speaking, I kept thinking, you know, about women like Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, you know, who's so influential in the Black Women's Club movement and in late 19th century activism in so many different ways. And just thinking about, you know, what if we had a public process to think about what those missing pieces in the landscape are, you know, or what those missing interventions could sort of be like. And what if we promoted that across a number of different communities, right? Where it's not just the same old, but what if, you know, it's folks living in Roxbury or folks living in, you know, who live in Via Victoria here in Boston? What are the monuments they would want to Puerto Rican, you know, liberation sort of fighters? What would those things kind of look like? So trying to be supportive, and I think institutionally getting around some of that sort of monument making and that deliberate kind of public process to talk about, you know, those monuments that bother us and what do we sort of want to see in their place, or what do we put next to them or adjacent to them, or that engages them in some way. I think that would be something I'd like to see have happen. And I think Boston is of the right kind of scale to make that happen, and the right kind of, I think, community of people who need to really come together to talk about these things, because we probably live in one of the most hyper-segregated cities in the United States, and we need to start having these conversations, I think, and maybe that would force all these other issues to come out that we really need to talk about.
Shawn, what would you like to be the future of public monuments?
So I agree with everything that was just said. I think that would be really powerful. I also think kind of what I would like to see moving forward, and what I think is already definitely happening, I think we're doing it right now, is a look backwards to also understand those monuments that we see in those public spaces that, maybe you walk by every day and don't think about. But take that second look, understand where that came from, have that public dialogue and that discussion about who created those things, who put them there, and whether those pieces are something that still, reflect community values, whether that's, something that needs to be changed, altered, or just to have that conversation, have that discussion, and use, these public monuments and memorials as a way to have, a constructive, thoughtful, and if necessary, which often I think it will be, a painful dialogue.
And Dr. Baumgartner?
Yeah, I echo all of that. And I would just sort of maybe reiterate what Dr. Nieves said about monuments to movements and to events or to ideas, and maybe, fewer monuments to people. Although I would also support a monument to Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, so.
All right. Well, I think now we're going to open it to the Q&A. So I'm going to go through and hopefully volley some public questions to you. Anyone out there who's watching, if you have a question, just drop it in the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. Malcolm asks, how does the normal human struggle to reconcile or heal after horrible conflict contribute to our understanding of what monumentalism is about?
That question makes me think about, I've done a little bit of work in Rwanda, and it makes me think about the churches that were preserved where Tutsis were killed, and how they remain as monuments to the genocide, but interestingly, they aren't necessarily protected from the elements, so that part of the process of having them actually decay in the landscape, so they become part of the land again, and that's sort of taking back and taking over in an interesting way, of that kind of layering. I think it is one thing that makes me think about the shifting sort of nature of what monumentalism can be, and how it needs to be sort of much more aligned with sort of the temporal nature of in the cyclical way in which we think about history and the way we think about these events. So I don't know why it sort of took me back to those churches that I've been to before, but it made me think about that very interesting how their meaning changes over time, and that, maybe they aren't going to always be there, but at least sort of the memory of those places will be there in the end, once they're totally re-enveloped by, the landscape, or deteriorate completely in the landscape.
Question here, it says we, and then it says in parentheses, affluent white parents. So this is about affluent white parents specifically, have recently been discussing and learning how to talk to our children about race, how to teach elementary school students about real history. Do you have advice or examples, good or bad, of using monuments, field trips, or discussions about monuments to foster or quash these discussions?
I would say that using just like personal examples, if you have, you know, younger students or children and you're bringing them to see these monuments, you know, they can describe them, they can look at them, and they can tell you what they see. And you can use that as a way to kind of, you know, if you have an understanding, there's someone there that has a deeper understanding of the piece, you know, it's a way to have them use that art to look at it and say, you know, what do you see here? You know, you look at, again, for example, the Shaw Memorial. It's like, what do you see? It's like you see men marching. What do they look like? What's the emotion on their face? You know, they're stoic, they're determined, you know, brave, courageous. But then it's also like, what else do you see here? You know, you look at, there's a guy on a horse, right? It's like, what's the difference between the two? And using those kind of visual strategies, you know, you can use that to say, look at this monument and let's kind of unpack what this means and give it a little bit more of a greater context.
Yeah. Does anyone else have thoughts on talking to children specifically about this? I'll say, I mean, you saw, I'm a mother of a young child, and I wrote a whole series of blog posts specifically about monuments and markers and public memory. And my daughter actually was like sitting over my shoulder as I was doing it. And there was a photo of the beheaded Columbus statue. And she just said, well, what's that? Because it caught her attention. Why is that statue like that? And that was a great opportunity for me. And of course, she is 5. I think at the time she might have been 4. And that was a great opportunity for me to say, well, that's a statue of someone that wasn't very kind. And people put that statue up because they thought that he was a great person. But now we realize that he was not a kind person. And what he did was not right. And so some people are upset about it. So they broke the statue. And it was a great way, a sort of like age-appropriate way to get into that with her. And specifically because this is something that's in the built environment, especially when these things are being altered or children are noticing these changes, that's a great time to just sort of get in there and in an age-appropriate way, describe what's happening, because kids get it. They get these things very, very easily. Let's see. More questions. Someone says, we have these Mass Bay tercentenary signs from 1930 all over the state. Whoa, oh, sorry, it just started moving. Has there been any effort to recontextualize these? For example, one in Wayland talks about the brave settlers defending the town against King Philip and his Indian warriors. E.g., I noticed a quote, correction plaque at First Encounter Beach on the Cape. The old plaque celebrates the colonists' landing. The new one emphasizes Native American efforts to preserve their society in the face of settlers. Has anyone seen anything like that?
You know, there was a great organization back in, I want to say the late 1980s, early 1990s. It was called Repo History, R-E-P-O History. And what they did was they were kind of a guerrilla arts organization that went around New York City and installed signs on telephone poles and light poles with pink triangles that told the LGBTQIA history at the time of sites and locations. And I've always wanted to sort of do a little bit of that sort of guerrilla artwork where you'd sort of come in and install this kind of signage right next to a sign that, you know, is giving you that history of Faneuil Hall. You know, can we have a different kind of symbol and can we tell a different story of that place and go around the city and put those things in there, right? And these were all based on LGBTQIA histories, sort of, you know, silenced or erased kind of histories. And I've always thought that those are some interesting and real ground up kind of way that you could do some of that work, right? To sort of tell that kind of more that more important kind of history that's been overlooked and that kind of silence history that's been overlooked. Yeah, or maybe I just want to be sort of guerrilla artist in my.
You said you weren't an artist.
Yeah, I know. Maybe that's the architect thing in me. I can install things. I just can't, make good things.
I think all historians are some kind of artist at heart, though. Someone once said to me that history is creative writing, but with boundaries, and I think that that's totally true. I think there's an artistic bent to this. Dr. Nieves mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa and the resulting museum and monuments. Could something like that happen here, and could that be part of a reparations investigation?
I've said a couple of different times at other talks that I think the place to start is given our former president and the kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we really need to have happen because of the past 4 years. That I think that would be an interesting place to start, because there's so much that we just don't know about what's happened, but I think it also would, again, allow for the conversations to happen. And I think the TRC was something that, was televised actually and broadcast on TV every night. And, there weren't that many TV stations at the time, so you couldn't avoid seeing the TRC once you turn, your set on. And so in a lot of ways, I think there's some value in that. And I think one of our neighbors to the north, Canada, has done a lot of this work, this kind of reparative justice work, particularly around, Indigenous and Aboriginal communities. I think we've got some good lessons nearby to sort of take up and find ways to do that. But it's definitely a complicated process, right? And I think it involves having lots of different folks come to the table and talk about the different kinds of issues that are thorny and need some kind of discussion, and need, some reparative work done.
We got a helpful notice from someone. It says, "Hello, Shawn. Titus Kaffar is the artist you may have been thinking about. Great artist. Also, Candy Wiley and Kara Walker. Thanks." So those are some artists that everybody should check out. And we also have a question that says it's for Shawn, but probably anyone could answer it. Maybe Shawn is best to answer this one because it's specifically about establishing monuments in Boston, but Kabria is working on this kind of work too. So Laurel asks, "I am wondering whether there is an effort to create meaningful monuments to Indigenous history in the Boston area."
So that is a great question, something that I think is very valued and needed. But to my specific knowledge, and this could be something that's happening on a higher level above me, and specifically looking through the lens of the NPS, so I can definitely open this up to other folks here. I am not aware of anything specifically that is in the works or is being created.
Yep. Does anyone else know about any monuments or markers for Indigenous history?
I don't know of any, but I was reminded of the controversy surrounding the Hannah Duston statue. There's a controversy around it in New Hampshire, and of course there's a statue in Haverhill. So I think at least in New Hampshire, there's an Indigenous group called Indigenous New Hampshire. It's a fantastic group. And they have talked about how problematic Hannah Duston was and the fact that there's a statue. But I believe they've been working with the state, and that statue won't be removed, but it'll be, as Dr. Nieves talked about, there will be a discussion, and there will be another statue that I think depicts Indigenous experiences. And so when someone goes to that site, they will see Hannah Duston, but they will also see something depicting Indigenous stories and Indigenous experiences. And so that they're working on that, and that's New Hampshire specific. I don't know if there are any plans around the Hannah Duston statue in Haverhill, but perhaps some Native groups are involved in that as well.
And somebody points out here that there's lots of discussion and some change regarding high school mascots. And I'm wondering what about your thoughts, high school mascots and how they differ maybe from monuments and maybe the ways in which it's more important to make changes or not make changes with high school mascots.
I wouldn't say that those conversations are going to be any easier, but I think they'll have a much faster and greater impact because of the importance of teams to sort of local development, sort of local life, getting folks back together again. I think having those conversations and really engaging the number of publics, right? And I think we know from history that many of those discussions at university levels um, go back to dollars and sort of alumni dollars, and how do you get them to sort of give if you change the name of your team. And we've seen some great ways that folks have done those changes, and some schools that have been pretty resistant to doing those changes. And so I do think it's one way, I think, to affect the most discussion very quickly. I think if schools were to sort of embrace that kind of renaming and to think about what's possible. I know at my former institution at SDSU, the Aztec warrior, that has absolutely nothing to do with that part of Southern California in any kind of way, shape, or form, was kind of the go-to. And they did a massive study and they put together a commission, and they've basically tabled the entire discussion because it's way too controversial and it's getting too many alumni riled up. But sort of inaction, I think, is in some ways even worse. I think there has to be some kind of a response, and having a giant commission and putting together a 300 or 400 page report about it and then doing nothing, I think, is the worst sort of result. And so I think there have to be ways to engage with those conversations, at least have those conversations and get them started.
Yeah. All right, so we are running out of time. So I want to give each of you an opportunity to just plug something if you want to plug it, or tell people where they can find more of your work, and then we'll say goodnight. I will start with Shawn. I'm just going to go clockwise around my screen now.
Sure. So if you're interested in visiting our site, we are not currently offering guided walking towards the Black Heritage Trail right now, but there are many self-guided opportunities. We've been working a lot on our website to improve resources as well as kind of those digital sources for people to use. Our partners, the Museum of African American History, though, they are open. You do have to go to their website. I can drop that link in the chat for a time ticket entry, but you get to check out their exhibit as well as go inside the historic African Meeting House. Definitely worth a visit.
Dr. Baumgartner, anything you want to plug? Tell people to find?
I don't have anything specifically, but I would say, as we sort of spring comes to an end and we enter the summer, I think this is the time now for us to, maybe it's, we're vaccinated, we can kind of walk outside and take a look at the landscape, right? In this area, in Massachusetts, right? In area of Eastern Massachusetts, and see what monuments and memorials and plaques are there, right? Maybe we can take better notice of Boston's and Greater Boston's landscape over these next few months. And I'm always happy to talk about Robert Morse and other Black activists. And I'm very interested in anybody else who would be interested in telling a story of Black civil rights in Eastern Massachusetts and memorializing that in some way, shape, or form.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Nieves.
So I'm just going to shamelessly plug these two things, but actually a third thing. The first is a book I wrote a couple of years ago that actually looks at the lost cause and sort of alternative monument making by African Americans at early historically Black colleges and universities, and how one can begin to think about these Black college campuses as monuments in different kinds of ways to, to freedom and to the Black community. The other is just a site where I talk about the great work my students are doing on the project in South Africa. But then I think in all cases, Shawn, Kabria, and myself are involved in the sort of rethinking of America's 250th in some interesting ways, and trying to think about a more inclusive way of thinking about that sort of celebration that's coming up in 2026. And we're working real hard to bring those kind of silenced, unknown voices to bear. And so I think I just want to echo Dr. Baumgartner's call for, if there are stories out there of civil rights workers, the long civil rights movement that you know of and that we need to know of or should know of, if there are some great, family collections out there of memorabilia or of organizations, please reach out to us and let us know, because we can find venues and avenues to preserve that sort of documentary evidence, those papers, but also bring those stories out in different kinds of ways. And the Park Service has been doing great work in that, and really rethinking their role as facilitators in the telling of these alternative stories. And so I'm shamelessly plugging the Park Service because it is doing a re-examination of itself and has done great work on LGBTQIA history as an African American and women's, and so it's a different kind of Park Service than maybe when I was way younger, and was about those sort of monumental stories of the great white men. That's kind of not the way the Park Service really sees itself anymore. So it's a great organization that I know I've enjoyed working with. I think Dr. Baumgartner obviously has enjoyed working with in different kinds of ways. And so let's work on our national parks and find ways to tell these stories.
It's great. I love
Thanks
the
for the
Park
plug.
Service. I did a stint as a Park Service intern when I was in grad school. So I've also drunk the Park Service Kool-Aid fully. So I want to thank everyone for coming. My job was to keep this conversation going, but if anyone is interested, I did write a series of blog posts specifically about monuments and markers on my blog, which I can drop into the chat, and follow the work that we do at the Framingham History Center. I'm actually currently working on a digital exhibit to reinterpret and recontextualize the story of King Philip's War in Framingham. So if anybody wants to follow that work, you can find us at framinghamhistory.org. I'll also drop that in the chat. I want to thank all three of you. This was a great conversation. I want to thank the Wayland Public Library and the First Parish in Wayland. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.